All right. Thank you so much for being with us today. For those who've joined us live, I'm here with the wonderful Mai, who's our general manager.
Hello, everyone.
And Mai, you have dabbled in the world of budgeting for quite some time.
Doubled.
Just doubled and dabbled. So we're excited to have you on board, and I'm really excited to pick your brain to understand how budgeting works and what are some of the things that we look at. And we'll also ask some questions. If anyone in the audience has any questions, we'll take some live questions as well. So again, we're really excited to share our insights with you today. And we want to start off with just going over a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. So a lot has happened in the last 12 months, and we're going to cover a little bit about the shift in direction and landscape. And Mai, I'm sure the strategy for everything changed in the last 12 months.
That's absolutely right. And I think that's probably what makes budget planning so challenging this year. It's always challenging thinking of, right, what do I need to get in a row now to make next year a success? But because we're for the first time doing it in this environment where everything changed last year, it's particularly daunting for some people now.
Yeah, and the good news is we're seeing a path to recovery, but I think we have to be a little bit optimistic as well going into the next few months. And we'll cover some objectives, some key objectives, and some key considerations and questions that we have to ask ourselves when it comes to planning for budgets. And then we've also got a couple of budget scenarios, which I'm really excited about, because I think you and I have sort of gone back and forth and said, what are some of the coolest ways of how we can move the numbers based on the objectives as well. So I'm really excited to share that as well. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A as well. And if anyone has any questions throughout the entire presentation, feel free to drop it into the chat as well. And if everyone can kindly put themselves on mute, turn off their cameras, that would be great, as we will go through the presentation a lot more effectively. So let's start off with the shift in direction and the changes. And from there's three really key things that I've noticed. But before I get into, the digital side of things, let's talk a little bit about the changing media landscape. You had a lot of really interesting things when we did this discovery about what you have observed. I'd like to pick your brain a little bit. What have you noticed when it came to the actual media landscape?
I think what's been interesting over the last year, and it's something that's been happening for a number of years now, is that the media landscape, and by media I mean media outlets, so digital and print media outlets, has been shrinking. And increasingly we're looking to social media for our news and for all the places that we'd go to those traditional sources for. And what we found interesting about that as a communication agency is lots of clients come to us for PR consultancy. So as we see the media landscape contract, we'd think, oh, people are going to want less PR because there's less media outlets. Right. But actually, we've seen a huge demand from clients who want help with their PR strategy, because actually, as the landscape contracts and there's less media outlets to get into, it's harder to get into them, right? Because there's less space, because there's less outlets, but also these media houses have suffered so much in this economy. We see outlets, magazines, newspapers folding every day, so they're very short-staffed. So it's harder to get the attention of them, and it's harder to get the space in the first place. So people are finding increasingly that they need PR experts to help them figure out what's a really, really strong editorial story.
Right.
So that's something that we've observed, which surprised us, I suppose.
And I guess it's also forced brands to go back to the drawing board. So there's probably a lot more strategy sessions, a lot more work on messaging, and just reevaluating everything as well, I'm assuming as well.
That's right, particularly because everything from your customer's life to your sales channels to your marketing channels has just been tipped on its head. And I think quite a few businesses, us included, took that downtime of COVID when we found ourselves not as busy to get back to the drawing board and think, right, who are we as a business and why is that relevant to the landscape today? And how are we going to use this to propel our business forward once we start to see the landscape stabilizing, which thankfully it is at the moment. So now is a great time to be propelling forward. Right.
And I was watching the project last night, and they were saying that we're hitting the 1-year anniversary when things started to go into lockdown. And the one thing that really re-emerged after lockdown was the digital activity, everything from e-commerce to advertising. It took a while, and then all of a sudden everything just re-emerged and resurfaced again. So digital has also grown, and we've got some interesting statistics to share with you on the digital side of things. But I would say the landscape, the strategy, digital, these are some of the shifts that we've noticed in the last few months as well. So let's look at some of the stats. And I've got some interesting points here that I wanted to make. So the first chart here shows us in billions the ad spend worldwide from 2019 all the way to 2024. And the interesting entity here is that digital is gradually growing. And in 2021, it's estimated at 389 billion. But by 2024, that's almost going to double. So that tells us an interesting story about digital, and the media ad spend is sort of gradually growing, in a consistent phase. Obviously, there was a dip and change last year with, some months not being effective for a lot of businesses, but it looks like this is the year for businesses to get back up there again before they continue. So that's the first takeaway that I've seen from the worldwide spend. But it's interesting to note in the second chart that both Australia and New Zealand are expected to be in the top 10 countries globally to see media ad spend growth. And these statistics are coming from eMarketer. So these are some of the projections that they're seeing as well moving forward. And as we work ourselves through the impact of the COVID virus, we noticed that with media ad spend, a lot of the digital outlets, things like digital advertising, social media, search, all of these activities are growing. And we're starting to see a decline in things like cinemas and print and radio. So it's really just showing this sort of emergence of the digital arena and how brands have to be prepared for this. The question that I have for you, Mai, is, people go, well, does this mean that messaging, PR, comms won't exist? I don't think so. I think it will just evolve. What are your thoughts?
Right. And I think, to me, the messaging and the comms, that's the foundation of everything that you're doing, and digital is just the channel. So I don't think that the foundation can ever go anywhere if we want to be successful. But what it does mean is that we have to adapt.
That's right. That's right. Adapt and evolve, I guess, is what they're saying, right? And so let's get through a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, okay, what are some of the pillars, or what are some of the channels that we need to consider to build a marketing budget? And I'm curious to know, as sort of a budget analyst, what do you look at from these 5 pillars as well? So we've tried to, take all the different cost things and put them into 5 key pillars here. And, we've got the PR, the traditional PR or digital PR, we've got communication, we've got the digital entity, we've got content, we've got technology. What do you look at first, Mai?
I mean, I see these as, the interesting thing about these is the way they interplay with each other. So at the top 2 there that you have there, the technology and the content, they're like the basics of everything you need. By technology, we mean everything from your CRM and how you're automating your marketing through to the back end of your website, any technology that you're using as a platform for what you're doing. And then on the flip side of that, the content is the kind of fuel that you're putting in.
That's right.
The stories, the messages. And those 2 things are so crucial to invest in. So that you can be funneling those into the channels that you want to communicate through. So PR is an incredibly strong channel for brand building, for awareness, for building credibility for your brand. Digital is a great channel for growth, for conversion, for lead generation, and a great marketing to me works when those 2 things work perfectly hand in hand, backed by the right technology and the right content.
Right. And that all basically pieces us to being that communication hub for the brands that we partner with. Yeah. In many ways, we end up being that critical fabric to a brand because we end up utilizing all these different pillars to get that right messaging to the market as well. Yeah. All right. So, let's ask ourselves, and this is a good question for any brand or business looking to figure out their budgeting. There's some critical questions that you have to ask yourself. And I'm going to go through these questions, Mai, and what I'd like to do with you is to figure out what insights you have for each of these questions. So the first question is, where are the pain points in the business? What are you looking at when you look at pain points?
And look, these are great questions. I think for me, the pain points in the business, the most important thing is having a bit of a customer journey mapped out and thinking about the journey from somebody first hearing about your brand to purchasing, right, and understanding where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are along that journey and where people are dropping off. Right. And that to me is where you need to focus your attention. So your pain point might be, you don't have any awareness. Nobody knows who you are in the first place. You've got to start there. There's no point going to the end of the journey and thinking about your conversion and your e-commerce presence. if your brand doesn't have the awareness and the credibility amongst the audience you're trying to reach. So being really honest and really, really critical about where you are and the challenges that you're facing.
What are we trying to achieve? That's a common question that everybody asks when it comes to business planning. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's different for every business. Most people currently, most of our clients are trying to achieve sales, right? And I guess it goes back to that journey of you need to achieve, the weakest point along that journey is the one you want to crack.
That's right.
So you might be trying to achieve more conversions, but before you even get to that, what do you need to achieve before that? Do you need to look at the quality of the leads that you're generating? Do you need to look at the channels where you're being seen in the first place before you even get to that lead?
Right. And when we ask where are we right now, are you looking at resources, people? What are you looking at typically? Yeah, everything, I guess.
Everything. I mean, that is such a big question where we're at right now. But yes, everything from the resources we've got, what assets do we have? Is our message right? Like, is our story compelling? Are we selling the right things? Are we targeting the right customers?
Right. I like this question. What are the opportunities? Because most of the time we focus on where we want to go, but sometimes we overlook this question. What are the opportunities? What are you looking at when you ask this question?
Yeah. And for me, I think it's also about seeing what have I not thought of? Like that so much has changed. You see all these brilliant stories of these customers that adapted their business in COVID, from, pubs that had to pivot to deliveries because people couldn't come in anymore. It's so important to have that positive mindset and to find the space, I guess, to take a step back and to be creative with your team about, is there something that we've not considered? Because with great change comes great opportunity. So it's important to look at the flip side of the pain points and where along that journey have we not considered where we could bring somebody in.
It's almost like it opens up to all the blind spots as well. What resources did we need to solve our problems? I'm assuming in this particular case, we're referring to softwares or processes or policies. I mean, it really encompasses the execution or people.
Training, agency support, connections.
Right. And especially with the movement of all the people, there's so many different gaps that we have to fill in a business or in a brand as well. So these are some interesting questions, and I invite the audience to throw in some of their own questions that they're exploring at the moment. But these ones really, if you nail these answers and if you understand these answers, it will really set you up for a proper planning as well. Is there anything else we should consider, Mai, I know I've been picking your brain in the last few days as well, but is there any other question that we could throw in there?
I mean, there's so many questions under each of these questions. I suppose what I'd say on this is just going back to my point about taking the time and the space to sit and answer these questions properly. I think these are questions that should be asked amongst your leadership team if you have one of your business, as well as the people in your business in a kind of closed door meeting where you just put away the day-to-day and just think laterally for a bit, and also try and get lots of information and inspiration in front of you. So when we're doing our marketing plan for the following year for Elevate, we'll have, interesting news articles and customer feedback and staff feedback and all of these things in front of us to inspire that insight that might give us that one idea that's going to be the killer idea.
Okay. All right. So let's get into the meats and potatoes of this presentation. And I think the critical impact here for me, the biggest takeaway was when you said the outcome defines the budget. The planning for the future really comes down from what your key objectives are. And so we started brainstorming, like, what do some of these scenarios look like? And one of the things that we looked at was what the objective is and what is the impact to the business. So we've got 3 different objective scenarios here. The first one falling under performance. And some of the examples that we've thrown in here is list building, traffic, advertising. And a lot of these key areas really impact the business because it builds about that conversion, whether it's sales or building an email database. From a digital perspective, we're really looking towards that call to action and that conversion. Tell us a little bit about brand building. What does that look like to you as well? And what's the impact to the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, these 3 objectives were built by us basically on the key challenges that we seem to see in our clients again and again. And what's really key to me is understanding which of those challenges is yours. So your challenge might be awareness. nobody knows who you are.
Yeah.
And the strategy for building awareness is very, very different to the strategy conversion. It's more of the foundational work. So PR, getting your profile out there, winning awards,
right.
things that not just get people aware of who you are, but build your credibility. And that's what the brand building piece means to me.
Right.
The second objective that we would consider is connection. So people might know who you are. You might have great brand awareness, but maybe people don't understand what you stand for. Maybe people don't understand what you sell and why exactly they need it. And that's where messaging comes into play. So your communication strategy, the content you're creating, the stories you're telling.
Right.
And to me, these almost go in a chain, starting with awareness, moving into connection. So you might be aware, but are you connecting with me?
Right.
Do you get that I'm for you?
Right.
Then we can move into the third objective, which is conversion.
So it's almost like a journey, essentially.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it's rarely a lateral journey, because I think even once you've got awareness, you still need to continue working to keep building that awareness.
That's right.
When you've got connection, you might then need to connect in different ways with the same people, or connect with different people in order for you to grow. So I guess that's why we've not plotted them out in a consequential list, because they all play into each other. But I think one of the biggest challenges that I think I see a lot is people wanting to jump to conversion, and they haven't laid the foundation of awareness and connection first.
That's right.
And then they spend all of this money on lead generation ads, and why isn't it converting? And oh my God. But the reason it's not converting is because we haven't just set those foundations first.
Oh, focused on the messaging as well.
That's right.
So what you're really saying is you must be changing budgets quite often if you're going through this journey, because essentially you're creating a budget for all of these milestones.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
That must be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love it.
That's awesome. So look, we've got so many different outcomes here, and what we wanted to do is really give you guys a case study by scenario. So we've come up with 2 different scenarios, and I think it really speaks to these 3 layers as well. So we've got 2 examples here. We've got a brand storytelling scenario, and we've got a lead generation performance scenario as well. And I think when we talk about brand storytelling here, we're really talking about brand driving. We're driving the brand essentially as well, and building as well.
It's playing into the awareness objective.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we've got different activities, and we wanted to come up with the scenario, but this is, this could add on. So they could be other things. We could be adding things like internal comms for the brand building, but we've got a couple of activities here. So maybe you could take us through a few milestones in the brand building scenario. And we've got a couple of line items here. We've got messaging, we've got, PR and influencer profiling and industry profiling. We've got internal comms, we've got award submissions, we've got storytelling. Video storytelling is a pretty big trend, but storytelling can evolve into so many different contexts as well. Mai, take us through your process when you were building this budget.
Yeah. So I think for me, this is a budget designed for perhaps a business that has undergone a lot of change over the last year, has maybe redefined who they are, perhaps as a result of the landscape changing, or redefine their customer and how they reach them.
That's right.
So what we've built into this budget is a lot of that foundational work I've talked about. So everything from getting the messaging right, 25%, it's a huge amount. By messaging, we mean everything from the messaging to the content to the story development. Then we've put in a good allocation there for PR. So media relations, influencer relations, partnering with credible, influential people out there to spread your message for you, which if you have low awareness or low credibility as a brand, is going to be the most powerful way of getting that message across through a third party.
Right.
We've also thought about things like internal comms, particularly if you're a larger organization. If you've changed the script slightly, you need every member of your team
to be on board,
top to bottom, to be on board with that vision and to understand what it means for them and how they do their jobs. And in some cases, that can take an enormous amount of effort to go through that process, especially if you work in a complex organization. So that's something to think about as well. We've put in award submissions or any kind of industry profiling, really. Sometimes we need to get the recognition of our peers and our industry to demonstrate to our customers that we're legit.
Right.
And also video storytelling we've put in there. So if I'm trying to build awareness of my story and who I am, video is an incredibly powerful medium these days, and that's the direction I'd want to be moving in my digital activity, to tell a story.
That's right.
So that's the brand storytelling scenario.
I like it. And would you say that internal comms often gets overlooked in this scenario sometimes because we're so busy trying to put out all these fires that we just assume everybody's on the same page?
Yeah, it does and it doesn't. I think, some large organizations are incredibly onto internal comms, some less so. But I think also, even if you're in a small organization, that internal comms is so important, and it might not be a 15% of your budget
That's
job
right.
if you're in a small company. That,
Yep.
it might be something much simpler. But even just things like thinking about away days, staff newsletters, staff emails, the way that you're telling your staff, this is the way our business is headed. And this is what each of us needs to be pointing towards for our business to succeed. Your people are everything, and you've got to think about how you communicate to them.
So my scenario is an evolution from your scenario. So in our scenario, we took a client of ours who'd already spent a lot of time with their content. And so they had already worked on some of these elements when it came to the brand storytelling, but they didn't know what to do with it. So they were looking at driving more leads and performance. So we looked at what are some of the critical layers. And in this particular case, we're actually showcasing an existing client who has spent some time in content. So we've allocated some budgets to creating that ebook and designing those landing pages. They've already invested in a software, so they have a legitimate technology, but they haven't used it before. They've spent all this money on this technology, so they need to start investing in the actual email marketing process to nurture those relationships. We've got web development, we've got social media, but the majority of our marketing activity in this particular case was digital advertising to get more leads, because that's essentially where the outcome really lives under. So in our scenario, it's interesting because none of these things would actually come to play if the brand had not focused on its storytelling. So it's an interesting connection between the brand storytelling stage and the lead generation stage, because you can't get to the scenario on the right without actually perfecting the storytelling side. What was really interesting for me, Maya, was that you had no numbers, but percentages. That was a really interesting takeaway for me. So tell me your thought process behind this. I guess everybody's working with a different budget.
That's right. But I think, generally speaking, when you look at a budget, big or small, when you drill it down to percentages, you'd be surprised that many budgets look the same.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So you've applied this model both for large businesses and small businesses, and look,
it's not an exact science. It's not like I just plug things into that formula and boom, there's your budget. There's a bit of shifting with every business, but this to me is what a typical brand awareness budget should look like. Right. Whether you're dealing with millions or thousands.
That's right.
And moving into the lead generation scenario, I think what's interesting to me is when I look at that huge pot for digital advertising, which is absolutely right. If I had a business who was at the brand building stage, apply that much budget to their digital advertising without having got their story straight, got the message straight, figured out exactly who they're targeting. This is generally what's happening when people say, I'm not getting any conversions.
That's right. And what I like is the fact that you have brands that are at different stages, so they have to adapt their strategy, their tactics based on the needs of where they are today. They're asking themselves, where are we now? And what do we need to do to get to our overall objective? And that differs based on scenario as well. So look, I think this is a really great scenario, and I think we should probably open this up to the attendees for some questions as well. Before, feel free, if you're watching this live, feel free to drop in your questions here as well. We love to take some questions. This is our information, how you can contact us as well. Mai, you're on LinkedIn, and you have access to yourself through email and phone as well. We'd encourage you to bring some of the questions that you may have. And if you want to speak to us privately as well from a budgeting perspective, feel free to pick either one of our brains. We'd love to do a session with you as well and potentially give you some insights. But we already got some questions here. So the first question is, media relations a tactic just for bigger brands who can afford a longer wait time to see return on investment? Or is there an opportunity for smaller brands to leverage a media campaign? That's a really good question.
That is a really good question. And I think what I love about that question is the longer wait time to see ROI, because I guess that's true in a sense, because PR and media relations is a long-term strategy, not just because when you're dealing with the media, you don't just jump in and say, hi, feature this story, and they just feature it. You build a relationship with them over time, they respect your brand, and then the profiling will later follow. But also because PR is just one small piece of the pie, right? It's a very important piece of the pie, because it gives you that special credibility that I think nothing else does.
Right.
If somebody reads about you in a completely unbiased source, that's going to persuade them much more than me telling you.
That's right.
That I'm great. So, but as to large and small businesses, I think that PR is very relevant for all businesses. But as the question has put it, as part of a long-term strategy, and not putting everything into your PR, because the reality is that we need to see a business in so many touch points before we convert. So I've heard some people say you need to see them in 5, some people say 12. Where the magic happens is when someone thinks, they get targeted with a digital ad, for example, but they think, oh, this is that thing that I read about in the Courier Mail the other day. And actually, oh, my friend mentioned them and that influencer I followed. Okay, so fine, maybe they're legit. And that's when conversion happens.
That's right.
Because you've built a relationship with this business by seeing them everywhere. And that's where PR is crucial for me. Where PR doesn't work is when somebody says, I'm going to launch a brand, I'm going to do a massive PR campaign, and I'm not doing anything else. And there's my coverage, I'm in the paper, I'm just going to sit and watch my website and wait for the sales to come in. It doesn't work like that. It's one part of many parts that all make that magic happen. So that would be my advice there.
Awesome. We got another question here, and this is for a fresh brand wanting to work with an agency. Would you recommend them doing brand building and lead generation activities simultaneously, or stagger the approach across through a period of time, a few months? That's an interesting positioning.
I think
would it depend on the brand?
It would depend on where they are.
Yeah.
And when we say stagger, I mean, I wouldn't be staggering things too much. Let's be honest, like, you've got to know who you are. We sort of make money, right? Yeah. So we're not going to be like, let's sit and figure out our story for 6 months before we sell anything. That's not the reality of how a business operates.
Yeah.
But I would definitely recommend, if you're working with any external partner, agency or otherwise, spending a little bit of time immersing them in your business and also using their fresh eye to give you perspectives on things you haven't done before you jump in and act. So I'd say, in answer to the question, I think a little bit of a stagger is good, just as a learning time to get a few ducks in a row. But you can do brand building and lead gen work simultaneously. It's more that I wouldn't want you jumping into lead gen work without having
your messaging nailed, any
brand building in place.
That's right. And so in your experience, another question I had for you is, we talked about technology, we talked about people. Does that fall in the realm of marketing? Is that a separate entity? How do you position that?
It totally falls into the realm of marketing. I mean, people do marketing, and we market to people. Yeah. So your people and the makeup of your team and the skill they have is absolutely critical. And the technology is critical as well. That's the kind of the engine of how everything works, particularly when you get into things like automation and that kind of the systemization and the digitalization of business. Right. That's such a strong advantage to a business when you've got all of that in place. So to me, that's what marketing is.
So if we had to wrap this up as far as critical takeaways, know where you are.
Yes.
And that will in turn tell you what your objectives are, which will then determine the direction that you're going with and creating your scenarios, and then you can build your tactics from there.
That's right. And then attach the budgets to the tactics and know how much to invest in what and which channels are actually going to work for you.
Amazing. Well, Mai, I really appreciate your time today. And for everyone that's been here as well, we're really appreciative of your attendance. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Mai or myself. We'd love to hear from you. And we wish you a fabulous rest of your morning.
Yes, and if you're planning your budget now and you want to just workshop it, I'll be happy to do that with you.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for your time, and thank you for visiting us today.
Thank you.
Cheers.